No questions about drugs? All right. Well, if you do have them, feel free to bring them up whenever. Email me too. All right. If that's the case, then let's move on. The next chapter is going to be human development. And this is a longer chapter. There's tons of information in here. And so I need to set you up a little bit for what is going to be presented in the lecture. What we're going to do, so we've exited a unit of this class that I call subjective experience. When we talked about sensation and perception, and then we went into consciousness, all of that is about how do you take information from the outside world, these sensory events, light, sound, etc., into your nervous system, and how do you have an experience based on you bringing in light and sound, etc. Consciousness then was how can that experience change or be altered, altered states of consciousness. So all of that was about subjective experience. What we're moving now into is the final unit of this class. And this is going to cover development, psychological development, physical and psychological. And we're going to start out with a chapter that reviews what most people go through. That is, what can you expect someone's psychology to look like when they are first born, through toddlerhood, through adolescence, into adulthood. And after that, we're then going to get into psychological disorders, which is how do things go differently for some people. We'll learn that psychological disorders, I actually don't like the word disorder that much, because what we're learning is what we typically thought of as disorders in the past may actually be, in some cases, not all of them, in some cases just simply be a different way of the brain working. For example, something like autism. There are many social challenges to having autism, or being on the autism spectrum, as it's called. However, there are some, I think, unsung advantages to having autistic-like traits. And the real problem is not necessarily that someone has autism, but that our society may not be set up in such a way that really utilizes the unique strengths of someone with autism. So we'll go into that. We'll talk about essentially quote-unquote normal development, then we'll go into deviations from normal development, that is something different than usual. So what we're really describing in this chapter is how does thought and behavior change across time? Or to put it in the context of everything that we've been learning about, these are biological and psychological changes that occur throughout the lifespan, or how do each of the things that we've been talking about change across the lifespan? The biology of your nervous system, sensation and perception, learning and memory and consciousness. How are these things expected to change? So that's what we're going to get into. So to do that, we first have to discuss some of the research methodologies that people use to examine change across time. I'm going to ask this, I'm just putting this question out for you. How would you study this? If you were going to, let's say that you were the very first psychologist studying how thought and behavior and all this, other stuff we've been talking about changes across time, how would you do that? How would you study that change across time? You've each been designing studies, experiments. You designed one for your research proposal number 1. You'll design another one for research proposal 2. Imagine that in your research question, you wanted to examine that research question as it changes across time. So if you wanted to know whether, if someone is cheating now, are they likely to, say if someone has a history of cheating, are they likely to cheat on their current partner? If you wanted to examine how someone's likelihood to cheat on someone over time is, how would you study that change over time in willingness to cheat? What would that experiment have to look like?
Wouldn't you have to determine how often the people?
I think you cut off there. So you'd have to determine how often what?
Like the person would cheat or was cheating?
Okay, but how would you record that? What would you have to, how would you have to record that to study how it changes across time? Maybe record how often someone cheats, but over what time span would you have to study it?
The time span of the whole relationship.
Yeah, you might have to study how often someone is cheating, say, at the time the study started, 6 months later, a year later, 2 years later, 3 years later, and continually do that. See how that changes across time. Actually bring people into a study multiple times. That is how most developmental research is conducted. What they do is they bring children, a lot of developmental research happens on children because they are going through some of the most drastic development that occurs in the human lifespan. So a lot of people will bring in children, and then they will study them, say when they're 6 years old, and then study the exact same thing when you're 7, exact same thing when you're 8, et cetera, and then document differences in whatever intelligence test that you're giving, a test of their personality, et cetera, et cetera. So we have 2 designs for doing this, and I want you to be familiar with each. One is called a longitudinal design. The other is called a cross-sectional. A longitudinal design is when you recruit one group of people and you study them across time. So you recruit a group of children who are 6, and then you're going to give them a test, and then you record, say, that same test, you give them that same test a year later to the same exact group of children. And then you again give that test to that same exact group of children another year later when they're 8 years old. So you're following the same group across time. What that's going to give you is you can study how an ability within an individual is developing over time. An alternative to that is, rather than following the same people across time and seeing how they act when they are 6, when they are 7, when they are 8, instead you recruit at one time people of different age groups. So you recruit a group of 6-year-olds, a group of 7-year-olds, 6-year-olds, 7-year-olds, and 8-year-olds at the same time, and then you give them that test. That's also getting at the question of, how does this ability change between when you're 6, when you're 7, when you're 8? But what is the difference between those 2 designs? Which one do you think is better? If you had to choose to do a longitudinal study or a cross-sectional study, would you have a preference, and why? Why? Why longitudinal?
I feel like it would be more accurate because you're following the same people.
It would be more accurate. Why? What are you, when you follow the same people, what are you accounting for? You're not accounting for in a cross-sectional design.
Say that again.
So when you do a longitudinal design, it is more accurate. But why? What are you accounting for in a longitudinal design that you are not accounting for in a cross-sectional design?
You know, it's the same people, so I don't know.
If you were, let's say that we're assessing intelligence at age 6, 8, and 10, all right? If you study intelligence in the same people, you know that the only difference, let's say that you do observe differences between 6, 8, and 10-year-olds, that the 10-year-olds are smarter than the 8-year-olds, the 8-year-olds are smarter than the 6-year-olds. You know that if you study the same people across time, that the only difference between those age groups is what age they are. Versus if you're using a cross-sectional design, it could be that the 6, 8, and 10-year-olds are different because of their age, but it could also be that they're different because different people. There are what are called individual differences in personality, for example. It's kind of like if I divvy this group up, you guys might be slightly different ages. I could compare the 18-year-olds to the 19-year-olds to the 20-year-olds. And it could be that the 20-year-olds in here are different from the ones than the 18-year-olds. I don't know whether it's because you're a different age or it's because you are a unique person with your own personality and experiences and everything that goes along with that. So with a longitudinal design, the big advantage is, yes, that you're observing actual change across time, but more importantly, you're accounting for differences between people. So yes, you're observing the same people across time. It is the same people, but the advantage of that, to put that in words, is you are accounting for differences between people. You are holding that constant. Remember that a lot of science is ruling out third variables. That was the point of an experiment. In a longitudinal design, you are ruling out the third variable of differences between people. Okay, well, why do you think cross-sectional designs even exist then? What are the disadvantages of a longitudinal design? When would you ever have to do a cross-sectional design?
Longitudinal designs take more time, most likely.
They do. They take a lot more time. They're a lot more expensive. And you have to count on these people coming back, right? You assess a child at 6 years old. When they're 8 years old, their family may have moved. Or maybe their circumstances have changed that they don't really have time to come back in, be studied again. So it's expensive. It's extremely expensive. And there's a problem of what's called participant attrition. Attrition means dropping out of something. So you can talk about high school attrition rates where people drop out of high school. That's attrition. If, say, you are, coordinating some project and one of the project members leaves, that's also attrition. Just generally refers to someone leaving a long-term project, losing someone. All right, well, then the advantage of a cross-sectional design is that it is going to be easier to collect data. It's going to be much cheaper. It's going to be much less of a headache because you're at just one time, recruiting these different groups. You don't have to worry about following them or worrying about participant attrition. The disadvantage clearly is that you don't account for differences between people. It is always something that could be muddying your results. And beyond that, you also have something that are called cohort effects. These refer to similarities or differences. I want to acknowledge that. These are similarities or differences between people due to a shared historical event that they have. So they are differences or similarities between people because of a shared historical event. All right, let me ask you this question. Let's say that we're interested in romantic behavior, dating, finding a good partner, the dynamics of hooking up at a party, et cetera, et cetera. All right, let's do a cross-sectional study. all right, to study this. We're going to get a group of 20-year-olds who are 20-year-old now, and then a group of people who are 40. And we're going to ask those 40-year-olds what were their experiences like with dating when they were 20, all right? What do you think? So if we interview 20-year-olds now versus people who were 20 years old 20 years ago, do you think they're going to have the same experiences with dating? Do you think 20-year-olds now are having the same experiences as those who were dating 20 years ago, who are 40 years old now but were dating 20 years ago? Is dating basically the same now as it was back then? Probably not. What is different now? Does anyone think that dating? I don't know. It's tough to say if you don't have a reference point, right? If you don't know what dating was like 20 years ago. But just intuitively, do you feel like dating is the same now as it probably ever was? If not, what's different? What do you think's different now versus 20 years ago in terms of dating? Nothing? No one wants to take a guess? No one's frustrated with dating now?
Can you repeat what you said, please?
Oh, sure. So if you were to compare 20-year-olds today versus 20-year-olds 20 years ago, do you think that they were having the same dating experiences or different? Is dating the same now as it was before?
Definitely not. Like,
Okay.
if you take in consideration how like our generations look at other people, like it's more of like sexual urgencies rather than actual interest.
Okay, so there seems to be a priority on the sexual aspect or the physical aspect or just kind of like getting together with someone maybe in the short term, casually. So would you say that maybe there's more like casual sex or casual like short-term relationships compared to in the past? Why might that be the case? What's different about now versus before?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that one more time?
Oh, sure, no, you're good. What's different? I mean, so if there is more casual sex now or more casual relationships, doesn't have to necessarily be sex. If relationships are more casual now, why?
I'm guessing more of like how everything has like changed over time. So like if you think about like how people used to think of relationships back then, it was more of like they cherished certain things. So like cherished, let's say, getting flowers for someone, but now no one would really think about that. They usually are like, oh yeah, I'll shoot her a text. So I'm guessing like since we've evolved through like electronics or stuff like that, our affection is completely different.
I think technology is a huge variable here. Yes, I think technology is big. I'm gonna. This is something I think everyone should know. But if you think about how people date now, traditionally, what would happen is you'd meet someone at a party, maybe going to church, maybe at school or at work, right? And the number of people that you met who were potential dating partners was pretty much your immediate local environment. Unless maybe you were in college, people were coming out of state, people were coming from other parts of the country, you're going to see more diversity there. But for the most part, your options were limited to who's around you. Well, with things like, you know, Tinder and dating apps and all of this, what you now have is you have this application that gives you so many more options than you used to have, that if one of those options isn't particularly appealing to you, or it is not a slam dunk, what you can do is just simply say goodbye and try someone else, because there are so many options available. Now, if you live in the middle of rural, you know, South Carolina, there's still not a lot of people around, maybe the world isn't so much different. However, if you're living closer to a city, or you're in Somerville, or you're in Charleston or Savannah, cities have a lot of people. You go on Tinder in a city and you will find tons and tons and tons of options. What that means is a lot of relationships, and this is kind of a hypothesis that has received some support in recent years. The idea is if you have more options, you will be less likely to invest in any given one. Because if one fails, you can replace it. If you don't have many options, that one person that you met at Ace Hardware, that one person that you really like at your workplace, may realistically be the best option available to you. If that's the only best option available to you, you're probably going to put more effort into making sure that that works, because you don't have an alternative. This is one of the ways in which technology has begun to shape how people date, how they mate, how they get together, is the difference between how many options you have. You have far more options now than anyone ever used to have. And sometimes that can be a problem. There's a thing called choice paralysis, where you have so many choices, you just don't really choose anything. So this is an example of a cohort effect. This is a historical circumstance, right? 20 years ago, dating apps were not as well developed. They existed, but not in the way that they may have existed, but they weren't as popular. Now you have tons of people on them, so you can find really whoever you want when you're looking for them. That's a cohort effect. A difference between 20-year-olds now and 20-year-olds 20 years ago is going to be in part due to this historical change, this change in technology. Of course, with that comes kind of changes in values too. And another thing that has changed is the mass availability of birth control methods. I think that casual sex is easier to engage in now, because the people who were most likely to be disadvantaged by casual sex, basically, I mean, both men and women can be disadvantaged, but women had a huge disadvantage because a woman can get pregnant. Well, you take that out of the equation, and now casual sex is not as risky as it used to be. So people are going to be more willing to engage in it. These are cohort effects. So a cross-sectional design does not account for these historical circumstances. And in fact, this is also a weakness of a longitudinal design. It could be, as you are following that group across time, you're not really taking into account whether that group that you're following might be unique because they grew up at a certain time. So what you ideally would like to do is combine these two techniques. And by doing that, you can overcome cohort effects. When you do that, that's called a cross-sequential design. In short, what you're doing is you take different age groups, as much as you would do that in a cross-sectional design, and then you follow those age groups across time. So this chart, I think, is really good at demonstrating this. There are a lot of arrows, so let me orient you a little bit. Along the x-axis on the bottom, you have the year of testing. So this is a chart. I forget exactly where I pulled this from, which article I pulled this from. I think it was a basic methods. There was no actual data associated with this. Let's say that we're measuring intelligence, okay? We want to know how 8-year-olds, 10-year-olds, 12-year-olds, 6-year-olds differ in their intelligence. So we're going to recruit them, And we're going to test them in 2002, we're going to test them in 2004, and we're going to test them in 2006. We are then recruiting along the y-axis people who were born in 1994, people who were born in 1996. So it's cross-sectional, and we're looking across time. If you investigate a group this way, you can see with each of those arrows, with the blue arrows, you're getting the longitudinal data. You're seeing how a 6-year-old changes when they are now 8-year-olds versus when they're 10-year-old, and how with the 1994 group, an 8-year-old changes to 10-year-old to 12-year-old. Okay, those are the longitudinal comparisons. And you also have the cross-sectional comparisons. You can compare 6-year-olds to 8-year-olds, or 8-year-olds to 10-year-olds, etc. However, the unique aspect of this are these green lines, and these account for cohort effects. What you're going to be able to do is not only follow a group across time to see how they change that way, but now because you have 2 groups of 8-year-olds, for example, you have people who are 8 years old when they're in 1996, and people who are 8 years old when in 1994. You now can compare 8-year-olds who grew up at different times. If you compare them at those 2 groups at different times, you can account for any unique differences between those 8-year-olds because of historical circumstances, because of differences in when they were born, or what experiences they lived through. That's the strength of a cross-sequential design. Now, what do you think that's the advantage. What do you think the disadvantage of a cross-sequential design is compared to the others? This is hugely expensive. You almost never see this kind of design. When an article publishes a design like this, it gets like national attention. It's regarded very highly because it takes a lot of money, even more than a longitudinal design would. And chances are you're having a fair amount of attrition where people are dropping out. And so usually the data gets all messy. But if you can pull this off, this is the perfect design. Cross-sequential. So each of these can be used to study how psychological capacities, thoughts, behaviors, how they change across time. They differ between age groups. All right, that's the first thing I need to introduce. I need you to understand the differences between those different research methodologies. The second thing I want to introduce, if you do not already know about it, is the nature versus nurture debate. You may have heard about this in another class. The basic idea here is, can we know how much of a person's psychology, their personality, their intelligence is due to their biology, and specifically, is it due to their genes? Is it due to what they've inherited genetically from their parents? Or is it due to their environment, the experiences that they had growing up, their experiences within their family or within their culture? So how much of who you are is due to your genes? How much of who you are is due to the experiences that you've had? Does anyone have an intuition about this? Does anyone kind of feel like, okay, we're mostly genes or we're mostly environment? What do you think most strongly shapes how a person turns out?
I believe it's more of an environment, because like there could be two of the same exact gene-based people in 2 of the completely different areas, and they could act nothing alike.
And that can happen. Does everyone agree with that? Everyone feel the same way? This is a tough question to answer. I mean, this is it's there are not many situations where you can attempt to answer this question, and you can't really definitively say because I'll spoil, this is actually a dead debate. It's not nature versus nurture. How this has changed, we know it's both. So first off, we know that there is a genetic and an environmental contribution to every single trait. And I am not overstating that. We can talk about anything. We can talk about your intelligence. We can talk about your personality. We can talk about the habits that you have, the preferences that you hold. Every aspect of who you are has some genetic component and it has some environmental component. It's really both. However, the new debate is how much of something is nature, how much of it is nurture, how much is due to your genes and your biology, how much is due to socialization or where you grow up, your experiences that you've had. So how would you study this? If this is the debate, how do we differentiate those two? How would you study whether a trait, let's take intelligence, how would you study whether intelligence is caused by genes or caused by the experiences that you've had? How would you study? Is there any situation where you could control for one or both of those things? Is there any situation in life where you can assume that someone shares all of their environment or that two people share all of their genes? Remember, in any scientific study, what you want to do is you want to try to control for third variables. So if you want to study how much someone's environment affects them, you need to control for the other thing, genes. Can we control for genes? Who has exactly the same genes?
Siblings that have the same genes.
Sorry, what was that, Haley?
The siblings.
Well, siblings don't. Siblings are actually 50-50. So we are only 50% related to our siblings. You're not an exact identical genetic copy of your brother and sister, unless what? When are siblings 100% identical genetically?
Twins?
When they're twins, identical twins. Identical twins are 100%. So there are two types of twins. There are identical twins and there are fraternal twins. Identical twins occur when you have an egg that is fertilized by sperm. It creates a single-celled organism. And very early on, that cell splits completely into two different ones. And so what you get is two individuals with the exact same combination of genes. Fraternal twins are when a woman releases an egg, she usually releases one. Instead, she releases two. And so two separate eggs are being fertilized by two separate sperm, which means that you're getting really two different individuals. So fraternal twins come out of the womb at the same time. They're born at the same time. They develop at the same time. But they have their own set of DNA. Okay. People realized this early on, and they started doing twin studies. There are, throughout the country, several labs that specialize in doing twin studies. That is, they bring in identical twins, and they test every conceivable psychological characteristic. This is actually how we know that every trait has a genetic and an environmental component. We have at this point taken pretty much every possible psychological trait, figured out a way to measure it, and then measured it in twins. And what you can do is you can differentiate how much of a trait is due to the fact that they share those genes versus how much is due to their unique environment when they're growing up. So I have a video on this that I want to show you. It's about 11 minutes long. It's given by one of the, I would say, most prominent twin researchers in the field. And I think that it does a very good job of showing what contribution a person's genes can have to what their personality looks like, what their habits end up looking like. So give me a second just to get this set up here for you. Okay. Here we go. Let's learn about twin studies.
Let's talk about twins. Twins turn heads wherever they go. Seeing two identical infants, children, or adults is irresistible, causing us to peer into baby carriages, stare into playgrounds, and even ask rather personal questions such as who is older, who is smarter, who decides what both of you will do, as if everything twins do is exactly the same. Society tells us that we all differ in appearance and behavior. So when we encounter two people who look and act so much alike, it challenges our belief in the way that the world works. We find ourselves intrigued and drawn into twins' lives, trying to understand them. For most of human history, psychologists believe that we're largely products of our environment. The twin research is teaching us that so many more of our behaviors than we ever would have imagined are influenced by the genes. There are two kinds of twins, identical and fraternal, and both are essential in twin research. Identical twins result when a single fertilized egg divides within the first 14 days after conception. These twins share all their genes in common. Fraternal twins share half their genes on average, just like ordinary brothers and sisters, and they result when a woman releases two eggs at the same time. They're separately fertilized by two separate sperm. We can compare the similarity of identical twins in running speed or in how fast they solve math problems to the similarity of fraternal twins. And if identical twins are more alike, and they usually are, this tells us that the genes play an important role. And most studies use identical twins raised together. Studying the rare pairs of identical twins reared apart is even better, because if identical twins raised apart are as alike as identical twins raised together, this is even more compelling evidence that genes are important in our development. Think about the identical Jim twins, Jim Lewis and Jim Springer, who grew up in different Ohio cities. They didn't meet until they were nearly 40. And they discovered that both twins hit their fingernails down to the nub. They both drove light blue Chevrolets. They both had mixed headache syndromes beginning in their teenage years. And they both liked to vacation on the same 3-block strip of beach in Florida. The Jim twins also both named their sons James Allen. Now, James is a fairly common first name. Allen is a much less common first or second name. Both of the twins had worked part-time in sheriff's offices and part-time at McDonald's. And they loved to scatter love letters around the house for their wives. And in a curious twist, both twins had married women named Linda, divorced them and married women named Betty. But then one of the Jim twins divorced Betty and married Sandy. You know that divorce is a partly genetically influenced trait, so you can imagine the worry on the part of the remaining Betty. Now, what about the twins, Jack and Oscar? They had dramatically different environments. Even that did not prevent them from amassing a whole list of similarities that surpassed even those of the Jim twins. Jack was raised Jewish by his father in Trinidad, and Oscar was raised Catholic by his grandmother in Nazi Germany. When they met for the first time, they discovered that both twins liked to wear rubber bands around their wrists. They thought it was funny to sneeze loudly in elevators. They both washed their hands before and after using the toilet, and they both read books from back to front, and they hated floral centerpieces because they said it blocked the view of the person seated across the table. How do we explain these similarities? Well, it could be that reading books from back to front suggests impatience, or sneezing loudly in an elevator is a cry for attention. But regardless, the fact that we see these similarities repeated in identical twins so much more than fraternal twins tells us that genes do play a role. Dorothy and Bridget, year-apart twins in Great Britain. They show us that you don't have to live with somebody to be like them. You only have to share their genes. When they met for the first time as adults, both twins were wearing 7 rings, 3 bracelets, and a watch. And the similarities did not stop there. The twins described themselves as short-tempered, disciplined, and strict. They liked the same brand of perfume. They liked the same kinds of books. They had worn nearly identical dresses to their weddings and carried nearly identical floral bouquets. They remind me of the identical reared-apart twins, Mark and Jerry. Mark and Jerry grew up in different cities in New Jersey, and they didn't meet until they were in their early 30s. They were both volunteer firefighters, but their signature quirk was holding a can of Budweiser beer with a pinky finger underneath. And you can see that they also carried huge key rings they attached to their belts. Belts had huge buckles on them. They both threw their heads back sharply when they laughed. They were 6'4", bald, and heavily mustached. And when I took them out to dinner, I discovered they had a shared passion for Chinese food and for steak served extremely rare. I also studied Barbara and Daphne, the Giggle twins. My colleagues and I affectionately call them that because when they met for the first time, they discovered that they laughed uncontrollably with each other and with nobody else. They had the same crooked pinky fingers, the same disinterest in politics. They drank their coffee cold, black, and without sugar. These twins had had a first miscarriage in their first pregnancy, followed by 2 healthy boys and a daughter. That may not be so surprising. Female physiology may in fact the sex of our children. In this case, the physiology was perfectly matched. Shortly after they met, they concocted a drink called Twin Sin. It was made of vodka, blue curacao, creme de cacao, and cream. My colleagues and I thought it was a little curious, but the twins thought it was just delicious. I finally want to mention 2 sets of identical twins, males, born in Colombia, South America. 1 pair from the city, 1 pair from the country. We don't know how this happened. Early on in the premature nursery, 1 newborn twin was accidentally exchanged with 1 newborn twin in the other pair. So these 2 sets of brothers grew up thinking they were fraternal twins. In fact, they were completely genetically unrelated. When they were 25, the truth was discovered and the real pairs were reunited. I went down to Bogota to study them. I discovered that the personalities of the reunited twins aligned almost perfectly. In one case, the twins were outgoing, gregarious, risk-taking. And in the other case, they were introverted, a little cautious, a little restrained. Again, we don't fully understand the reasons behind these similarities, but seeing them repeated in identical twins, more so than fraternal twins, gives us a genetic perspective on human development. And we need to think seriously about these findings because they have huge implications for how we raise our children and how we can all make the best of our abilities, our goals, and our dreams. So in my experience, parents of one child are environmentalists and parents of two children are geneticists. And I say that because parents of two children realize rather quickly what works for one child doesn't work for the other. And that's because children come into the world with their own genetic predispositions that lead them towards certain activities and places and opportunities. Parents have to have realistic expectations about each child. Two dancing parents may not have a dancing child, because even though each parent shares half their genes with the child, genes get reshuffled in each generation. You know, I tell parents, you don't really bring up your children, they bring you up. Because each child evokes certain treatments and certain responses from each of their parents. A child with athletic abilities should be given opportunities to play sports. An artistic child should be given opportunities to paint and to draw. And a shy child should be given opportunities to speak up more, encouraged gently to do so. In this way, parents can make a huge difference in the lives of their children. And I also want to acknowledge the teachers, the mentors, and the managers who work so closely with twins and others and affect their lives. As a psychology professor, I identified a very promising undergraduate student who showed real ability, talent, and drive. He was the first in his family to go to college. He lacked guidance and opportunity. I work with this student on a number of projects, and today he's an advanced graduate student at the prestigious University of Michigan. Back to our twins. Twins are not just mere objects of fascination. Just by being themselves, just by acting naturally, it gives science a powerful tool for understanding genetic and environmental influences on behavior. And in this way, they tell us about our humanity, why we are the way that we are, and how we got that way. Thank you.
Okay. Any immediate reactions to that? Is it surprising? It's also just kind of fun to see twins. But had anyone ever heard of this before? That twins will often have an astounding number of traits that are similar to them, similar between them, even if they weren't raised together. I think that we often hear that environment environment is almost all-encompassing. That really the differences between people are due to their different circumstances, and no doubt that is true to a great degree. Someone who grows up in a lower socioeconomic neighborhood are going to go through more struggles than someone who grows up relatively rich, relatively wealthy. No doubt those have an effect. But the argument here is that there is some disposition, there is some proclivity, there is some kind of preparedness that a person will have as they come into the world. And that preparedness comes from the genes that they hold. I want to share a bit of information to you that it may surprise you. There has been tons of this kind of research on intelligence. So how much of a person's intelligence is due to their genes versus their environment. And consistently, what comes back is the vast majority of differences between people in intelligence is due to their genes. So how we measure this is something called heritability. Heritability is a measure of, so if you have a group of people, if you sample just 100 people, you can see how they differ from one another. So some people, you know, if you give them an IQ test, IQ tests are centered on 100. So if you're above 100, you're above average on intelligence. If you're below 100, you're below average on intelligence. And so the idea is that you can measure the differences between people. You can see within the terms of statistics, anyone who's mathematically inclined, we're trying to measure the variance between people. That is, how much do people tend to differ from one another? So we can see how much of those differences between people is due to the genes that they grew up with versus the environmental circumstances that they had. You know, what kind of education did they have access to? And consistently, what research finds is that between 60 to 80% of the differences between people is due to genes. So intelligence is highly heritable. That has some consequences. That means that there are you have individually a potential for intelligence, how intelligent you are. And if you stimulate someone, if you put someone through a quality education, you send them through college, what you can do is you can push someone to the upper limits of their abilities. But there is going to come a wall at some point where investing more effort actually is going to give you less of a gain. So you can kind of push people up to a certain point, but they won't go beyond that. How do you feel about that? Did anyone know that? Has anyone ever thought about intelligence in that way? What's your reaction to that? Does that sound right? This is an important conversation to have because that does have consequences for, you know, it has consequences for people, how we school them, how we how we handle education. The idea is we should be pushing people to always embody the absolute maximum intelligence that they can. We want that. We want people to be informed. We want them to be intelligent. We want them to be educated. But there is also an upper limit. The greatest geniuses in the world who have existed, who have had the greatest breakthroughs in terms of technological or cultural advancement within human society. The argument here is that not everyone is equally capable of achieving that level of intelligence. All right, well, maybe that's not as profound for everyone, but that's profound to me. I find that an incredibly interesting idea. And I think that to step back and really think about how might genes contribute to what my personality is like, what my intelligence is like, what my preferences are, I think that's a really important question to step back and ask yourself and to ask about the things that you see in your world. All right. Questions about this, about nature versus nurture, the contribution of genes and environment to how we develop. All right. Everyone's sleepy or something. So this is all I have for you today. I am happy to go back to my first question of, do you have questions about drugs? Because we didn't talk about that much. And again, I offer that to you. But this is it for today. This week, I'm going to divvy up development into two sections. This week, we're going to talk about prenatal development. That is, what happens before birth. A lot of that is going to be explaining what DNA is, how genes work, I mean, really spelling out how could DNA actually affect your psychology. I'll outline some examples of that. We'll then go into a little bit of what happens between when sperm and egg meet and when a child is born, what kinds of things develop and what you should know about that development. Then next week, we'll get into postnatal development, what happens when that child is finally out into the world. And there we're going to talk much more about environmental contributions to development. So something of a genes versus environment divide within the next 2 weeks. Then after that, we'll get into psychological disorders. Questions, concerns, comments?
I have a question about our research proposals. So this past week I did both experiments, and she mentioned like you having like a survey or something, and I don't know if she was just trying to talk about like the 2 research proposals that we have to do on top of like the 2 experiments. So is that what she was talking about, or is there more that we have to do towards the end?
Yeah, no. So for hers, if you'd gone and you did the in-lab components, she wrote your name down and she's going to give that to me at the end of the semester. So you should feel fairly confident that you'll get credit for that. What she's referring to is, yeah, my online stuff. You know where that is on Blackboard?
I believe so.
Okay. Yeah, I could actually, hold on. Just a second. For anyone who still needs to see this, if you go to Blackboard, if you go to syllabus and course documents, you'll see that there's a research participation folder. This is where all those links are. So again, by the end of the semester, you need to go into here, find these online study links, and then participate in 2 of these studies. Of course, you can do a 3rd one. If you do more than the required, you'll earn an extra credit point for that. So these are the online studies. Other questions? All right. Well, thank you for being here. It's always a pleasure. And you all have a wonderful week. I'll see you next time.